Hello everyone, I'm Luke from Expert Aviator, and today we're going to be discussing altimetry. So this video is designed for S3s who are training in the UK, or people who are waiting for their S3 training. It is based off of that UK syllabus, but it should be applicable to anyone really. Just a disclaimer before we start, this isn't endorsed by that UK at all, so there may be some mistakes. If you do notice any, or if you have any questions, please do let us know in the comments and we will get back to you. So in today's video we're going to discuss some basic terminology which you should know from your S2 training, but we'll just review it anyway. We're then going to look at transition altitude, transition level, transition layer, minimum stack level, lowest holding level, and finally altimetry tables and pressure bands. So let's start with the terminology then. So here are just 3 definitions, and there are going to be a lot more throughout this video. You do have to make sure that you know these definitions without any notes in front of you. It is really, really important for radar that you understand the concepts without having to look them up. So let's get started with QNH then. So QNH is the altimeter setting that gives altitude above mean sea level. QFE is the altimeter setting that gives height above a specific reference datum, usually a runway threshold. And standard pressure is a value defined in ISA, which we'll get to later on, which is equal to 1013.25 hectopascals. When a pilot's operating on standard pressure, their vertical position is referred to in flight levels. So the key thing to take away from this is QNH is to do with altitudes, QFE is to do with heights, and standard pressure is to do with flight levels. So that's basically what we're working towards by the end of this video. By the end of it, you should be able to understand each of those lines and explain exactly what they mean. So we're going to start with the bottom line, which is the transition altitude. So the transition altitude is defined as the altitude at or below which the vertical position of the aircraft is controlled by reference to altitude. It's fixed, so it doesn't vary with QNH. A TMA, and don't worry if you're not sure what a TMA is, we're going to get to that in future videos when we do airspace classification. But a TMA shares a common transition altitude. So for example, all the airports in the London TMA share the transition altitude of 6,000 feet. All the airports in the Manchester TMA share the transition altitude of 5,000 feet. Key point is that the standard transition altitude in the UK is actually 3,000 feet, although it does vary quite a bit across the country. So although the standard's 3,000, a lot of the time the transition altitude won't actually be 3,000 feet, so make sure you check the charts. So rather than just throwing the definition at you, I prefer to think of this logically. So if you're the pilot and you're climbing out of an aerodrome, the transition altitude is the point where you switch from local pressure to standard pressure. Or, in other words, switch from flying on altitudes to flying on flight levels. So let's move on to transition level. Transition level is the lowest flight level available for use above the transition altitude. It varies with QNH, and to be quite honest, it's relatively useless in the UK for the moment. That's because ICAO, the governing body of aviation, have a slightly different definition that the UK hasn't actually adopted. However, we are going to adopt this in the coming months, so this will all change, but for now, this is what we're sticking to. Transition level is relatively useless. Just a point on it while we're here, it's not the point where you switch from standard pressure to local pressure coming down. You switch from standard to local when you're told descend to altitude by the controller. That is the point you switch. Now, it may coincidentally be the transition level when they tell you to switch. It will be around the transition level, but they are not the same thing, just to make that distinction. So let's move on to transition layer. So transition layer is the airspace that exists between the transition altitude and the transition level. It varies in size with the QNH. An aircraft can fly through it, but they can't level off inside it. So I've drawn you a diagram on the right hand side. You can see the transition altitude and transition level, and the green airspace is the transition layer. Where there are blue arrows, that's a pilot flying on local pressure, or QNH, and the red arrows are where it's a pilot flying on standard pressure. So, look at the pilot departing the aerodrome. He's on QNH altitudes until he hits the transition altitude, then switches to standard pressure and flight levels. Great. The one coming down, standard pressure and flight levels until round about the transition level when they switch to QNH and altitudes, and then they go through and land. Great. The problem is we have different coloured arrows in the transition layer. Now, if those two pilots are flying at the same time, we would have two pilots in the same bit of airspace on different pressure settings. It's almost impossible to ensure separation on different pressure settings inside the same bit of airspace without a lot of maths. So for that reason, that's why nobody can level off, they can only go through it. So let's move on to MSL, minimum stack level. This is arguably the hardest bit of altimetry, and it's what people struggle to understand. I will just point out before we go through the definition that although it's called minimum stack level, it has nothing to do with the stacks. So anyway, MSL is defined as the lowest whole flight level, which is separated from the transition altitude by at least 1,000 feet. It varies with QNH, and as with a transition altitude, a TMA shares a common minimum stack level. So take an example of Manchester and Liverpool. They both lie within the Manchester TMA. Let's just say that Manchester has a QNH of 1014, which would give them an MSL of flight level 60, and Liverpool has a QNH of 1012, which would give them an MSL of flight level 70. Now, we've just said there that that's two MSLs within the same TMA, but we said that a TMA has a common MSL, so something's wrong. So what actually happens in that situation is you always take the MSL of the major airport within the TMA. So in the Manchester TMA, any airport will use Manchester's MSL. In the London TMA, any airport will use Heathrow's MSL. So although Liverpool technically would be losing separation in that example, by about 50 feet, it's deemed by the CAA, they call it deemed separation. So it's deemed to be okay, that loss of separation. So anyway, by now you're probably thinking, great, I've got loads of definitions, loads of terms, but I don't really see how they all fit together. How do we use it practically, and how do we calculate any of them? Well, that's what we're going to get onto. So how do we work out what the minimum stack level actually is? To be able to work it out, you need to understand a thing called ISA, which is what we looked at the very start. ISA stands for International Standard Atmosphere, and it's basically a model that we use, a model atmosphere that we base performance calculations off. So for a controller, you very actually rarely use it, but for pilots, you use it nearly all the time. So ISA defines lots of different parameters, but three of the most common ones, if you want to call them that, are listed there: the density, pressure, and temperature at sea level. Now the only one we're bothered about is the pressure, and as you've probably noticed, that's the same as standard pressure. So that's where we get standard pressure from. It's from ISA. So you may think, well, why have you even bothered mentioning it if we don't really take much from it? The key thing you have to get from ISA is the last sentence on that slide. In ISA conditions, flight level 60 is altitude 6,000 feet. Flight level 65 is altitude 6,500 feet, and so on. However, when the atmosphere isn't ISA conditions, then flight level 60 is not altitude 6,000 feet, flight level 65 is not altitude 6,500 feet, and so on. That's the bit that people struggle to understand. So don't worry if you're still a little bit, unsure on it. It'll all make sense in a minute. So let's look at the formula to actually work it out. The first formula we do is the QNH minus standard pressure, and we times the result by 27, which will give us a value x. It's 27, by the way, because ISA says that 1 hectopascal is worth 27 feet at sea level. What we then do is we use the next formula. So the first flight level above the transition altitude in terms of altitude in ISA conditions. Sounds very confusing, but it's not. I'm going to not explain that just until we get to the next bit, then we can do it for example. You add x to that, and it will give you the first flight level above the transition altitude in terms of altitude today. What you then do is, with the value you've just worked out in that second formula, you compare it to the transition altitude. If there is a gap of more than 1,000 feet, then the level you've put into the formula is MSL. If it's less, it's not. So let's have a look at an example, because that's the best way to explain it. Let's assume we have a transition altitude of 5,000 feet and a QNH of 1003. So we put 1003 into the formula, minus standard pressure, and times that by 27. Make sure you're careful with the minus signs. When you round that, it gives you minus 277 feet. So what we do with the next formula, we take the first flight level above the transition altitude in terms of altitude and ISA conditions. So the first flight level above the transition altitude is flight level 60. We said that in ISA conditions, flight level 60 is equal to altitude 6,000 feet. So all we do is we put 6,000 feet in the formula. We then add x to it, and remember that a plus and a minus becomes a minus. So that gives us 5,723 feet. Or in other words, flight level 60 in today's atmosphere with a QNH of 1003 is equal to altitude 5,723 feet. So then what we do is we compare that number to the transition altitude. So as you can see, there's only 723 feet separation. That doesn't meet our requirement of 1,000, so therefore flight level 60 can't be used as the MSL. So what we would now do is we would now go back to the formula and put flight level 70 in. So where we put 6,000, we just put 7,000. We still minus 277, so it will give us 6,723 feet. That's separated from the transition altitude by 1,723 feet, so therefore flight level 70 would be the MSL. So let's move on to lowest holding level. So lowest holding level is a real simple one. It's the lowest level at which an aircraft can hold within a given stack. It varies with QNH and possibly runway selection. Places like Manchester, for example, it varies with runway selection. Places like Liverpool, runway selection has nothing to do with it. You just have to consult the local VMATs for guidance on that. The thing with lowest hold level is it isn't purely based on altimetry. It's also based on other factors such as airspace. And again, that's it'll be explained in the local VMATs. So let's put it all together on this diagram then. So the bottom line is the transition altitude. The next one up is the transition level, and in the middle of that in red we've got the transition layer. Above that we have the MSL, and above that we have lowest hold level. So you'll notice how I've drawn some blue on the diagram. The blue circles are aircraft, so we've got one aircraft flying at the transition altitude and one aircraft flying at MSL. The distance between those two aircraft is at least 1,000 feet. That is what MSL is. So in practical terms, you can't have an aircraft in the middle. So if those two aircraft were to get closer together, they would lose separation and get closer than 1,000 feet. So you can have one aircraft at MSL, or you have one at transition altitude. You can't have one in the middle. So basically, we never use anything in the middle of the transition altitude and the MSL. Finally, we've got lowest hold level at the top. The thing to note here is that there's one MSL per airport, except special cases like East Midlands where there's two. But there is a lowest holding level for each individual stack. So Manchester, as an example, has one MSL, 3 lowest hold levels. So moving on to the final bit, we've got altimetry tables and pressure bands. So in every VMATS Part 2, there will always be an altimetry table. I've put Manchester's on there for you. It may be split into 2 tables like that, but it's more likely to be in one table. The table on the right here shows you the lowest holding level, and the table on the left shows you the minimum stack level and transition level. The key thing to point out here is that there are things called pressure bands on that table. So on the left-hand side of the left table, you'll see it says high, high, low, low, double low. Those are pressure bands. So when we coordinate a change of controller, so when you're taking over from someone else, or someone else is taking over from you, and you do your coordination, we don't tell the other controller every single bit. We only tell them the pressure band. It makes the coordination a lot shorter, but the other controller can still work out what they need to from just the pressure band alone. So the pressure bands in the UK are defined as high pressure is 1014 and above, low pressure is 978 to 1013 inclusive, and double low pressure is 943 to 977 inclusive. Now for anybody who's been paying attention to this, you'll notice that that actually disagrees with the altimetry table. So in the bullet points, we said that high pressure is 1014 and above, but in the altimetry table, we said that high pressure is 1013 and above. And that brings us to that last bullet point that says note. In the London TMA and Manchester TMA only, 1013 is classed as high pressure. Even though that technically loses separation by 7 feet, it's deemed to be okay. So, just to reiterate that, in the London and Manchester TMAs, 1013 is high pressure. Everywhere else in the country, 1013 is low pressure. So I hope this video has been some use to you, and hopefully cleared up some questions about altimetry. To reinforce your knowledge now, apart from making your own notes on this and reading other material you may find, one thing that really helps is going back to the MSL calculations and trying to just do some calculations yourself. Pick a random QNH, pick a random airport so you're doing it with different transition altitudes, and that way you can check the VMATS Part 2 to check if you're correct. And keep doing those calculations until you fully understand the method of what you're doing. Then when you've done that, almost like an extension if you want to call it that, try putting 1013 into the formula and working out where we get our loss of separation by 7 feet. See if you can work it out. As always, any questions let us know in the comments, but thanks for watching and see you soon.